Charles Dickens has one of the most famous biographies in English literature, and his story could be the plot line of one of his novels, and in fact it pretty much is. If you've read David Copperfield, you know a lot about the early childhood and the adolescence and the young manhood of Charles Dickens. And there are many other characters. If you've read, as I said, Little Dorrit, and about the family being imprisoned in the Marshalsea prison for debt, you know something about his story. So look at when he's born. February 7th, 1812, in Portsmouth, down in southern England. He's the second of 8 children. Not all children born to John and Catherine Dickens survived. Not all of his own children survived as well. He lost a child with Catherine Hogarth. So his father, John Dickens, is a clerk in the Navy Pay Office, and is considered to be a really kind of genial guy, someone who was very sociable. He liked to entertain. He liked to tell a good story. He would do things like take little Charles with him down to the local pub. Charles was a performer early on, and put him up on a table and have his little son sing for the other patrons at the pub. And Charles writes about this in his autobiographical fragment as knowing that he was probably cute and entertaining to some people, and also probably annoying, right? That he had that parent who was saying, yeah, look how cute my son is, he's going to put on a show for you. So having that kind of sophisticated, kind of like dual understanding, even as an early child, I think is important. So the family is down in Rochester for a while. They go to London. They move to a lot of different places as the debts start to pile up. Merchants come to the house to collect their money. They're not getting paid. And at this time, if you were owed money and you weren't paid, you could submit a claim, and the debtor could be arrested and taken to the Marshalsea prison, which is actually over where it used to be. There's just a wall left there now, but it's over not far from the Globe Theatre. It's in Suffolk, so that part of London where the prisons and the brothels were in the Elizabethan age. And this was profoundly humiliating and traumatic to Charles, because when he had been in Rochester, he had been going to school. He had been learning Greek and Latin. He's a really, curious, active young boy, loved being a student. And right about the time that his family was imprisoned, as the debts are piling up, Charles goes to work in a blacking factory, Warren's blacking factory. And blacking is shoe polish. And his job was to paste the labels on the bottles. And he found this to be, incredibly redundant and painful and exhausting work. And he also suffered socially. He's this really sensitive kid, right? And feeling like these other kids working in the factory, they're different from me, and they're a different social class. They talk in a different way. They don't talk about the same things that I'm interested in. And so there's that side of him that is kind of predisposed to experience this injury to the greatest magnitude, right? And it is interesting, and a lot of scholars have talked about it. It's the 19th century, folks. I mean, you want to look at tragic backstories, like who doesn't have one? They're all over the place. Why, of all these writers, many who experienced, incredible trauma as children, is Charles Dickens seemed to be the one who internalizes his kind of hard times so painfully, and then he has to keep kind of rehearsing this history in his later fiction. So he stays in the blacking house for a period of, the factory for 7 or 8 months, when his family finally gets out of prison and his father declares himself an insolvent debtor. which is another kind of level of shame. And in fact, the Navy, after this case, actually made a requirement that people who declared themselves insolvent debtors could no longer receive a pension. But John gets in just before that, and so he's able to collect a pension despite this declaration being really humiliating to the family. So the family gets out of prison, and I should say while they were in prison, so Charles is living on his own. He's living in lodgings. He starts in kind of North London in Camden Town. The factory is down on the Thames. He's having to walk a long time each way, morning and night. He's got his little pennies to kind of get him through the week. He has to feed himself. He tells stories about, thinking about, should I like just go crazy and get like a sugar bun in the morning, knowing that I'm not going to be able to eat the rest of the day, but hey, I'll get a sugar bun, or should I, just get a penny loaf and be reasonable? He's going into pubs by himself and, getting a half pint of beer and feeling kind of like a man that he can do that. But he feels so wounded that nobody is taking any interest or care in him. So the family gets out of prison, but they do not immediately take Charles out of the blacking factory. And in fact, his father is like, yeah, maybe we should send little Charles back to school. And his mother says, keep him there. Keep him up in the factory. And he never forgives his mother for this. He says he will never forget and forgive her that she was warm to have him stay humiliated as a laborer in the factory. And what seems to be the turning point for him, the factory moves closer to Covent Garden, back in central London, and they set up a shop window, like one of those big bow windows, and as kind of like an attraction, like an advertisement, Charles is put on display in the window, pasting the labels on the bottles for people to walk by. And John Dickens, his father, comes by with a friend and it's like, oh, isn't that your kid working in that factory? And that seems to be what finally got him out of the factory. So he feels like he's absolutely on his own. His older sister, Fanny, was supported in a musical career, and she is at the academy, and Charles continues to feel the sting of being the kind of the other artistic child who is neglected. He goes back to school for a while. It's not a great school. It doesn't look like his parents really kind of, looked at his options. They kind of went with the easiest choice. But he's happy. He's at least in school. He's not going to stay in school all that long, though. It's pretty clear nobody is sending him to university. And so he starts on the path to independence. He becomes a clerk in law offices and then does something pretty remarkable. He teaches himself shorthand in about half the time it normally takes people to learn shorthand. And do you know what shorthand is? Have you ever seen it?
No idea.
Okay, Google shorthand. It's fascinating, right? It's different characters. We have Siri now. We don't need shorthand. But you used to need a fast way to capture the parliamentary debates or anything else. Reporters would use shorthand.
As well as a court reporter, they use that.
Symbols.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so rather than whole words and regular characters, it would be like a court reporter. Good. So what he starts to do is he records the parliamentary debates, and he becomes a newspaper reporter. He travels by stagecoach all over England for different events. He's like riding in the stage at night, so all that manic energy serves him really well. And he talks about, being kind of so impressed with the facility of his own brain and kind of talking to his brain about, thank you, it's a pleasure doing business with you, because he's so quick and sharp and accurate. And he starts to make it in the newspaper business. So he's working on Fleet Street. It's incredibly competitive, and yet he becomes a rising star. And then he starts to do these humorous sketches of kind of English life. And he gets published for the first time. First time he does it, he's like, yeah, you can have the story. After that, he's like, no, I'm going to get paid for this. And he gets paid for everything he writes from that point on. Pickwick Papers is his big breakthrough. And about this time, he falls in love with Maria Beadnell, who never seriously entertains him as a suitor. He's still doesn't have a real prospect out of being able to support a household. She gets satirized later in his fiction as being the flighty young kind of superficial love interest who becomes overweight and ridiculous in middle age. So he gets his revenge. And then he marries Catherine Hogarth. And the Hogarth family are Scottish. They're also literary and in the publishing industry. So kind of on paper, this looks like a really good match, that he needs to establish his own household. He wants that independence. Catherine is happy. She's pretty compliant. But she has to get married too, right? She's not going to have other career options. So now the novels start to come out. And you can see the early novels. You know these names, right? So there's not like a steep learning curve for Charles Dickens. He hits his stride really quickly, enjoys kind of instant and immense popularity. His style is going to change quite a bit, but his popularity really never flags. He tours in America. He does these theatrical kind of readings of his own works. He does a series of Christmas stories. Dombey and Son is distinguished as being kind of his first mature novel, and the tone starts to change. It starts to get darker. In his own family life, things are not going so well with Catherine. Do you remember how many children I said they had?
20.
Okay, and she probably gets pregnant on their honeymoon. So she's a very young woman, inexperienced woman. His complaint about her in like the first decade or so that they're married is that she is overweight and lethargic.
And she's pregnant every single year.
Right, so if you're pregnant for 10 years straight, you will probably be you're pregnant and lethargic. But here's that restless kind of artist spirit. And remember how Wordsworth characterizes the poet. He sees the poet as almost kind of a different category of human being, right? The poet has this capacity to feel things more deeply than other human beings. And we can be skeptical of that and say, yeah, you artists, you're not all that special. But Dickens might be on the side of at least feeling like he's different and he's special.
It's actually interesting with that because actually like somebody tried to have a study that proves that poets are actually more prone to like depression than any other like creative writer.
Mm-hmm.
Called the Savior Wow. For obvious reasons, but yeah.
Yeah, and we can talk about this with Virginia Woolf as well, but So you see that kind of evolution of his complexity in the novels from 1848 on. And then we get the dark novels. Bleak House is my favorite if you haven't read it yet. Read Bleak House. We're reading Hard Times, which is unusual for its concision. Little Dorrit is the one on the Marshalsea prison, the debtor's prison. And then now is when he buys Gad's Hill Place. And he is really interested in making money. And one of the interesting things about Hard Times is for all its criticism of kind of material wealth and, this desire to just accumulate things. The genesis of Hard Times is that Dickens' newspaper was not doing very well, right? So subscriptions are down. We need to sell more newspapers. This is Household Words, is his publication. And so he says, well, all right, to help out the paper, let's run a novel. We're going to do it in weekly installments. Now, writers at this time typically did novels in monthly installments, which is brutal enough. I mean, think about the crazy composition and production schedule to meet that timeline. And writers like Elizabeth Gaskell would find really constraining, because you had to have a set number of pages. You've got to have your 32 pages by deadline each time. So each chunk, as you're conceptualizing your novel, it's going to have to be that structure. You also get a chance to respond to your audience because people are reading your book before it's finished, right? So that's interesting. So when the old Curiosity Shop comes out, and this is where you have that innocent child, little Nell, and things are not going well for little Nell. Hopefully I'm not spoiling the story for you because it's so famous. Oscar Wilde said something to the effect of, no person can be so hard of heart not to laugh at the death of little Nell, because it was such kind of a over-the-top, sappy Victorian death scene. But and that's in the old Curiosity Shop. When the books were coming to the United States, there were actually fans like lined up on the pier as the ship's coming in, like yelling to people on board ship, tell me, does little Nell die? So it's a really interesting kind of context to be writing in. But he's doing this for hard times on weekly installments. And he's doing it to earn money. So in the reading tours are a way of earning money as well. So he, according to a lot of biographers, burns the candle at both ends, but he never really does things any other way. And he dies of a stroke in his late 50s at Gad's Hill Place. Now, what happens with Catherine? So they eventually separate, which is really pretty unusual for the time. This is before reforms in divorce laws, making divorce easier. Divorce is an important issue in hard times. Who has access to divorce? We'll talk about that. And then he becomes involved with an actress, Ellen Ternan. And there's an interesting film and biography on her called The Invisible Woman. Dickens was very careful to destroy the letters that he had received. So the letters that we have are the ones that he sent elsewhere that people kept. They may have had a child, although it doesn't, there's really no evidence that supports that. There are just kind of a few lost years. And so there's lots of references to how kind of tortured he was by the sense of what he was doing to Ellen, who he's very kind of mysterious about this. He calls her in his letters sometimes the patient, like he's concerned about taking her with him to America because of the delicate condition of the patient. He also talks about her self-reliance and the trials and this incredibly difficult position for a self-respecting woman, he says of Ellen, to be in this relationship and to have everything secret and private because divorce is not an option. So when we look at a character like Bounderby, who has created these elaborate fictions of self-representation, and some of you are saying, well, it seems like there is some Bounderby and certainly some Louisa in Charles Dickens. I think you're right. I think we're talking about kind of incredible artistic and intellectual and psychic and emotional complexity here. So some of the web resources that I've put up, and I'll close with just pointing out the Dickens Project. We're really fortunate in our area. UC Santa Cruz hosts the Dickens Universe each summer. It's kind of like a summer camp for scholars. And you could go and hear lectures by world-class Dickens scholars, participate in undergraduate and graduate seminars. There is a Victorian dance and afternoon teas, but mostly it's pretty academic, and you have hot and cold running deer, so that's all fun.